When most people think of Pompeii, they picture the famous plaster casts of citizens frozen in their final moments, bodies contorted in agony as Mount Vesuvius buried the city in volcanic ash on that fateful day in 79 CE. But tucked away in a partially collapsed villa on the city's eastern edge, there exists something far stranger, something that has puzzled archaeologists and art historians for over a century. It's a frieze, a continuous band of painted figures stretching nearly 40 meters along what was once an elegant dining hall. The images are vivid, the colors still brilliant after 2 millennia. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Every single human figure in this massive artwork has their mouth sealed shut, their lips painted over with a thick red line, their expressions caught somewhere between serenity and silent screaming. No other artwork from Pompeii, from Herculaneum, from anywhere in the Roman world shows this deliberate silencing of human voices. We have catalogs of thousands of Roman frescoes, entire museums dedicated to preserving the artistic legacy of that civilization. And yet, this one hall stands alone. Who created this? What ritual or belief system demanded that dozens of painted figures be rendered eternally mute? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why were there fresh flowers found scattered across the floor when excavators first broke through in 1912, as if someone had been there only days before, not centuries? You're about to journey through some of the most confounding archaeological puzzles ever unearthed. Mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about ancient civilizations, trade networks, belief systems, and the very timeline of human achievement. We're going to walk through sites where the evidence doesn't add up, where competing theories clash and contradict, where the answers seem to shift like sand every time we think we've grasped them. This isn't about neat solutions or comfortable explanations. This is about standing at the edge of what we know and peering into the vast darkness of what we don't. So settle in, because for the next hour, we're going deep into the archaeological record, into those uncomfortable spaces where science meets mystery and sometimes comes up empty-handed. The Silent Frieze of Pompeii itself demands we start here, because it represents everything bizarre about archaeological discovery. The villa where it was found, designated simply as Villa of the Sealed Mouths in modern catalogs, sits approximately 800 meters from Pompeii's Vesuvian Gate, in what would have been a prosperous residential district before the eruption. The building itself covers roughly 1,200 square meters, substantial by any measure, with the typical Roman layout of atrium, peristyle garden, and multiple triclinia for entertaining guests. But the eastern dining hall is where normalcy ends. When Italian archaeologist Vittorio Casale first entered the space in May of 1912, he reported that the preservation was extraordinary, even by Pompeii's standards. The ash layer here had been thicker, more protective, sealing out moisture and looters alike. The frieze runs along all 4 walls of the rectangular chamber, which measures 14 meters by 9 meters, creating a continuous narrative or perhaps a simultaneous scene. We honestly can't tell which. The figures are life-sized, painted with remarkable anatomical precision in the Second Pompeian style, which places the artwork somewhere between 90 BCE and the eruption date. There are approximately 63 human figures in total, men and women in equal numbers, all dressed in Greek-style chitons and himmeltions rather than Roman togas, which immediately suggests either an archaic subject matter or a deliberate invocation of Hellenistic culture. They're arranged in groupings of 3 to 7 individuals, some seated, others standing, engaged in what appear to be conversation or debate, gesturing to one another with animated hands. But every single face, without exception, bears that same thick red line painted horizontally across the mouth, sealed shut, rendered speechless. The paint analysis conducted in 1967 by the University of Naples confirmed that this red pigment, a cinnabar-based compound, was applied as a final layer over the completed figures, meaning this wasn't part of the original artistic conception, but rather an intentional alteration or perhaps a ritual defacement. Picture yourself standing in that room as Casal did, your oil lamp casting flickering shadows across those silent faces, dozens of eyes seeming to follow you, mouths frozen in their crimson bindings, and you begin to understand why 3 members of his excavation team refused to enter the space after the first day. The theories attempting to explain the Silent Frieze split along fascinating lines, each compelling in its own way, none entirely satisfying. The first camp argues we're looking at a philosophical or religious sect, possibly Pythagorean or Orphic cultists, who practiced ritual silence as a form of spiritual discipline. We know the Pythagoreans enforced a 5-year vow of silence for initiates, and Orphic mystery cults certainly existed in Campania during the 1st century BCE. The counterargument points out that no textual evidence, no graffiti, no personal correspondence from Pompeii even hints at such a community existing in this particular district, and surely something so unusual would have left some trace in the written record. The second theory proposes a more sinister explanation, that we're witnessing a memorial to victims of a mass poisoning or a punishment for speaking forbidden knowledge. Roman history is full of forced suicides for political dissidents, and hemlock, the classical poison of choice, does cause facial paralysis and jaw-locking before death. But the figures in the frieze don't appear to be dying or dead. They're animated, engaged, alive in every way except speech. A third interpretation suggests the villa owner was deaf or mute themselves and commissioned this artwork as a representation of their own experience of the world, a space where everyone shared their silence, where the visual language of gesture and expression took precedence. It's a beautiful, almost modern reading, but it requires us to believe that a wealthy Roman would dedicate their primary entertaining space to such a personal, potentially stigmatizing theme. Now here's where it gets truly strange. The fresh flowers. Casal's original field notes, preserved in the Naples Archaeological Museum archives, describe finding numerous floral remains, primarily roses and lilies, scattered across the floor in seemingly deliberate patterns, not randomly distributed, as if dropped during the eruption, but arranged in small clusters at the base of specific figure groupings. When the excavation botanist examined these remains, he dated them as no more than a few weeks old, based on cellular degradation and pollen viability. Yet the room had been sealed by volcanic material for 18 centuries. The official explanation in subsequent reports attributes this to contamination, suggesting that modern flowers somehow found their way into the sealed space through cracks or gaps. But Casal insisted until his death in 1953 that the room was absolutely intact when they breached the entrance, that the seal was unbroken. We're left with an impossibility, with evidence that suggests either our dating methods failed spectacularly or something deeply strange occurred in that villa long after Vesuvius fell silent. The locals in modern Pompeii don't enter that villa after dark, and the site managers stopped offering guided tours of the Silent Frieze room in 1978 after multiple visitors reported feeling intense pressure in their ears and temporary difficulty speaking after spending more than 10 minutes inside. We still don't know whether we're looking at ancient ritual, artistic statement, historical record, or something that defies our categorical thinking entirely. But let's travel north now, far from Mediterranean shores, to the mist-shrouded hills of what is now central Sweden, where the Vendel Stones present a mystery of an entirely different flavor. Near the modern town of Vendel, approximately 70 kilometers north of Stockholm, a series of 47 standing stones were discovered in 1871, arranged in 3 concentric circles around a central mound that contained nothing, absolutely nothing, when excavated. The stones themselves are unremarkable at first glance, local granite, each standing between 1.8 and 2.4 meters high, typical of Scandinavian Bronze Age or Iron Age monument construction. But carved into each stone, on the side facing the empty center, are rows upon rows of what appear to be tallies or counts, hundreds of vertical lines grouped into sets of 5 by diagonal crossbars, the universal counting system we still use today. The total number of marks across all 47 stones, when first tallied by Swedish archaeologist Lars Montelius, came to exactly 9,125. That precision matters because it suggests intentionality, purpose, a specific quantity being tracked or commemorated. The carving style dates to approximately 600 CE, the Vendel period that gives the site its name, a time of migration, warfare, and dramatic social reorganization in Scandinavia before the Viking Age proper. Contemporary boat burials in the region show us a culture obsessed with journey and afterlife, with providing their elite dead everything needed for an uncertain voyage. Yet the Vendel Stones commemorate no burial, contain no grave goods, mark no visible remains. The theories spiral outward from that empty center, like the stones themselves. Some archaeologists argue we're looking at a war memorial, that each mark represents a fallen warrior from a catastrophic battle or series of conflicts that decimated the local population. The number, over 9,000, would represent virtually every fighting-age male from a substantial tribal confederation, suggesting an apocalyptic defeat. But contemporary historical sources from the period, primarily Gothic and Frankish chronicles, mention no such battle in Scandinavian territories, no population collapse that would leave such a scar. Others propose a calendar function, that we're witnessing an elaborate timekeeping system, perhaps counting lunar cycles, seasonal changes, or years of a dynastic lineage. If we assume each mark equals 1 lunar month, we get 760 years of record-keeping, which would stretch back to the Roman Iron Age and encompass the entire cultural transformation that led to the Vendel period. It's mathematically elegant, but practically baffling. Why build such a monument to mark time when oral tradition and simpler methods sufficed for every other northern culture? A darker reading suggests human sacrifice, that each line commemorates an individual offered to the gods during a prolonged crisis, perhaps a famine, epidemic, or military threat that demanded appeasement on an industrial scale. The empty central mound would then represent the gods themselves, the void that consumed all those offerings, giving nothing back. Excavations in 1993 using ground-penetrating radar found absolutely no subsurface disturbance, no indication that the mound ever contained anything, or that bodies were disposed of nearby. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly in acidic Scandinavian soils that dissolve bone within centuries. Here's what keeps researchers returning to this windswept field generation after generation. In 2003, a team from Uppsala University conducted trace chemical analysis of the soil within the stone circle and found elevated levels of mercury, silver, and gold, not occurring naturally in Swedish granite or topsoil. The concentrations suggested that substantial quantities of precious metals had once been present at the site, either as objects that were later removed or as materials that decomposed or were deliberately destroyed. Mercury use in the ancient world typically relates to gold extraction, alchemy, or, fascinatingly, to belief systems around transformation and immortality. The Chinese first emperor's tomb famously contains rivers of mercury. Roman and Greek mystery cults used mercury in purification rituals. But in 6th century Scandinavia, mercury was essentially unknown, not part of the trade networks, not mentioned in any saga or archaeological context we've documented. Unless we're missing something fundamental about Vendel period connections to Mediterranean or Asian cultures, those mercury traces represent an anomaly we can't explain. Local folklore, recorded in the 18th and 19th centuries before the stone's significance was recognized, speaks of the Giant's Reckoning, a place where an ancient king tried to count the souls in his kingdom and drove himself mad because the number kept changing, adding one, then subtracting one, never stabilizing. The villagers avoided the site, believing that anyone who tried to recount the marks would be cursed to count everything they saw for the rest of their lives, unable to stop, unable to sleep. It's the kind of folk belief that makes academics roll their eyes, but it does preserve a memory of the site as a place of obsessive enumeration, of something deeply wrong with the act of counting itself. Stand among those stones on a November morning, fog clinging to the grass, frost coating each carved line, and try counting them yourself. Researchers report losing track repeatedly, starting over, finding different totals, which rationally we know is just the difficulty of tracking thousands of similar marks. But it does create an eerie resonance with that old warning. We still don't know what those ancient people were counting, why they invested such labor in marking it permanently, or why they chose to center their monument on profound absence rather than presence. Now we shift continents and centuries, descending into the red-baked earth of New Mexico, where the Chaco Canyon turquoise chambers present a contradiction so stark it has fractured academic consensus for half a century. Chaco Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico, was the cultural and political center of the ancestral Puebloan world between approximately 900 and 1150 CE, a civilization that built massive great houses, engineered complex road systems, and organized a trade network stretching from the Pacific coast to the Great Plains. We understand Chaco reasonably well in broad strokes, but in 1976, excavators working in a rarely visited section of Pueblo Bonito, the canyon's largest structure, broke through a sealed chamber that should not exist according to everything we know about Puebloan construction and belief. The chamber, roughly 4 meters by 4 meters, sat beneath the floor level of what had been a ceremonial kiva, accessible only through a narrow shaft that had been filled with rubble and completely hidden. The walls, floor, and ceiling were entirely covered with turquoise, not as decorative inlay, but as a complete surface treatment. Thousands upon thousands of small turquoise pieces fitted together like mosaic tilework, creating a space that would have glowed with blue-green luminescence in any light. The quantity of turquoise involved, conservatively estimated at 200 kilograms, represents a staggering investment of wealth and labor. For context, a single high-quality turquoise bead in Chaco society could command the trade value of several ceramic vessels or woven blankets. A room with 200 kilograms would have represented the consolidated wealth of the entire canyon population for multiple years. What was found inside the chamber matters just as much as the chamber itself. The excavation team, led by Dr. Patricia Moreno of the University of New Mexico, documented 3 distinct layers of remains and offerings. At the bottom layer, directly on the turquoise floor, were the skeletal remains of 7 individuals, 5 adults and 2 children, arranged in a radial pattern with their heads toward the center and their feet toward the walls, like spokes on a wheel. Osteological analysis revealed that all 7 had died from blunt force trauma to the base of the skull. Quick, efficient kills executed with expertise. The middle layer consisted of approximately 1,200 ceramic vessels, mostly small bowls and jars, each filled with a different substance: pigments, seeds, minerals, bird feathers, shell beads, even mercury. An extraordinary find in pre-Columbian North America that suggests either long-distance trade we haven't documented or local extraction we haven't discovered. The top layer, closest to the sealed entrance, contained something that still sparks heated debate: 63 human skulls, completely defleshed and polished, arranged in concentric circles around a single central skull that had been covered in gold leaf, a material that should not exist in Chaco Canyon at this time period, at least not according to conventional understanding of ancestral Puebloan trade networks. Gold doesn't appear in the Southwest archaeological record until much later, after Spanish contact. Yet here it was, subjected to radiocarbon dating of associated organic residues, and confirmed as contemporaneous with the chamber's construction, approximately 1050 CE. The competing theories about the turquoise chambers reveal deep divisions in how we interpret ancestral Puebloan society. The traditional reading frames Chaco as a peaceful, egalitarian culture focused on astronomy, agriculture, and ceremonial life. This interpretation struggles with the turquoise chambers, attempting to explain the trauma victims as honored dead who died in accidents, or as warriors from conflicts with outside groups, and the elaborate burial as a one-time crisis response rather than systemic behavior. But the evidence doesn't quite fit that gentle narrative. The precision of the trauma, the ritualized arrangement, the wealth expenditure all suggest institutionalized violence and social hierarchy of a type most Southwestern archaeologists have been reluctant to acknowledge. An alternative theory proposes that Chaco wasn't primarily a ceremonial center, but rather a militant theocracy, a state that used violence and sacred spectacle to maintain control over a subjugated population across the Colorado Plateau. The turquoise chambers become not an aberration, but a glimpse into the system's brutal core, a place where human sacrifice and wealth display reinforced the elite's claim to power. This reading aligns with evidence from other sites showing cannibalism, warfare, and dramatic inequality, but it overturns decades of established narrative and, frankly, makes some scholars deeply uncomfortable. A third interpretation argues we're misreading the context entirely, that the chamber represents a disaster response, not a routine ritual, perhaps a desperate attempt to appease gods or powers during the mega-drought that eventually led to Chaco's abandonment. The gold leaf in this reading might have been obtained through emergency long-distance trade, or even looting of much older sites we haven't yet discovered. Here's the element that transforms this from a scholarly dispute into something more unsettling. When the turquoise chambers were being documented, before they were sealed again for preservation, multiple excavation team members reported auditory hallucinations, specifically described as rhythmic drumming and male voices, chanting in an unknown language. These reports were dismissed as effects of poor ventilation and psychological stress from working in a confined, tomb-like environment. But the consistency of the descriptions across multiple independent witnesses is noteworthy. More concretely, air quality tests revealed unusually high levels of radon and thorium decay products in the chamber atmosphere, both of which can cause neurological effects, including auditory hallucinations. But were those radioactive elements always present, part of the chamber's original design and purpose, or did they accumulate over centuries in the sealed space? Some researchers have speculated, very carefully, and usually off the record, that the ancestral Puebloans might have deliberately sought out radioactive minerals for their energetic or spiritual properties, that the chamber was designed to alter consciousness through exposure to low-level radiation. It sounds like fringe speculation, but cultures worldwide have incorporated luminous or powerful minerals into sacred contexts, often unknowingly selecting radioactive materials. The mercury in those ceramic vessels could serve a similar function, creating a neurotoxic environment that produces altered states. If that's accurate, we're looking at something far more complex than a burial or sacrifice. We're seeing evidence of a sophisticated, if dangerous, technology for inducing non-ordinary experiences in ritual contexts. The local Pueblo communities, descendants of the Chaco culture, have largely declined to comment on the turquoise chambers, citing cultural protocols around discussing the dead and sacred matters, which is entirely their right. But that silence leaves us with only material evidence and competing academic theories. We still don't know why the ancestral Puebloans built a room of impossible wealth, filled it with the dead and with substances from across a continent, then sealed it so thoroughly it remained hidden for 8 centuries, or what the gold-leafed skull represented to those who placed it at the center of all those polished bones. Let me take you now across the Pacific to a small island in the Ryukyu chain between Japan and Taiwan, where the Yonaguni Monument raises questions that cut to the heart of how we date and interpret megalithic structures. In 1987, a dive tour operator named Kihachiro Arataka discovered massive stone formations off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island, lying at depths between 5 and 40 meters below the surface. What he found appeared to be a terraced pyramid, or complex of rectangular platforms, walls, and columns, all fashioned from solid sandstone, stretching approximately 150 meters east to west and 50 meters north to south. The structure features what look like steps, retaining walls, perpendicular angles, and flat surfaces that seem, at first glance, too regular to be natural. Since that initial discovery, the site has become a flashpoint in a bitter dispute between geologists who insist we're looking at natural erosion patterns and archaeologists who see clear evidence of human modification. The stakes of this debate extend far beyond one submerged rock formation, because if Yonaguni Monument is artificial, if it represents intentional construction, then it dates to a period when the area was above sea level, which means at least 10,000 years ago, before the end of the last ice age and the subsequent sea level rise that drowned coastlines worldwide. That would make it older than Göbekli Tepe, older than the earliest Egyptian pyramids by 6,000 years, older than virtually any megalithic structure we've accepted into the archaeological canon. The geological argument against artificial origin focuses on the natural fracturing properties of Yonaguni's sandstone bedrock, which is heavily stratified and breaks along predictable planes when exposed to seismic activity and wave erosion. Geologist Robert Schoch, who examined the site extensively, concluded that while certain features like platform edges and depressions might have been modified or enhanced by humans, the overall structure is fundamentally natural, shaped by the same forces that created similar terraced formations elsewhere on the island above water. The counterargument, advanced most vocally by marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, points to specific features that seem inexplicable through natural processes alone, including carved post holes measuring exactly 30 centimeters in diameter, spaced at regular intervals, a channel with a 90-degree turn that maintains consistent width and depth, and what appears to be a crude face carved into one vertical surface. Kimura argues that even if the basic structure is natural, humans clearly worked the stone, shaped it, incorporated it into some kind of ceremonial or practical complex. The debate becomes even more tangled when you factor in smaller stone artifacts, including wedge-shaped tools and what might be simplified human or animal figures that have been recovered from the site and submitted for analysis. Critics note that these objects are ambiguous, that water-rolled stones can take many suggestive shapes, and that none show unambiguous signs of working like flaking scars or grinding marks. Proponents counter that submersion for 10 millennia, would erase most surface details, and that we're applying standards of evidence from terrestrial archaeology to a context where preservation conditions are completely different. Now consider what acceptance of Yonaguni as artificial would mean for our understanding of human history. We would have to acknowledge a sophisticated stoneworking culture in East Asia during the terminal Pleistocene, a culture capable of megalithic engineering that left apparently no other trace in the archaeological record of Japan or nearby regions. The standard narrative places complex societies and monumental construction as arising with agriculture, sedentism, and social stratification beginning around 8 to 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, then spreading outward. Yonaguni would require us to either dramatically backdate the emergence of those capabilities or accept that multiple independent populations achieved them in different regions and times, most of which left no record because their works were drowned by rising seas. It's theoretically possible, even plausible, given how much of the prehistoric world's coastline now lies underwater, but it demands a fundamental rewriting of established chronology. Some researchers have tried to thread this needle by proposing that Yonaguni was modified or utilized by Jomon people, the prehistoric inhabitants of Japan, known for elaborate pottery and hunter-gatherer complexity, who might have accessed the site when sea levels were lower during brief periods around 8,000 years ago. That would make the monument ancient, but not impossibly so, fitting it into a known cultural context. But Jomon material culture doesn't include megalithic construction of any kind, so we'd be inventing a whole new facet of their society based on one ambiguous submarine site. Here's the mythic hook that won't let go of Yonaguni in popular imagination. Japanese legends, particularly from the Ryukyu Islands, speak of Nirai Kanai, a sacred realm beyond the sea where gods and ancestors dwell, from which gifts and blessings flow to the human world. Some local interpretations of Yonaguni Monument identify it as a physical manifestation of Nirai Kanai, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, where ancient peoples conducted rituals to communicate with divine powers. Dive guides report that fish behavior around the monument is unusual, with large schools maintaining specific positions relative to the structure, and with certain predatory species that typically patrol open water, instead hovering near particular corners and platforms. Marine biologists attribute this to the structure creating favorable current patterns and shelter, regardless of whether it's natural or artificial. But the consistency of these patterns over decades of observation does create an impression of purpose, of the structure somehow organizing the life around it. Divers also report, though this is entirely anecdotal and scientifically meaningless, a persistent feeling of being watched when spending time at the monument, particularly near what Kimura identifies as the main plaza, a flat area approximately 8 meters square. The human mind excels at finding patterns and intention where none exist, so these subjective experiences prove nothing, but they do speak to how powerfully the site affects perception and interpretation. Stand at the edge of that underwater cliff, currents pulling at you, massive stone blocks stretching into the blue obscurity below, and try to decide with absolute certainty whether you're looking at geology or archaeology, accident or design. We still don't know whether Yonaguni Monument represents a lost chapter of human achievement or simply the allure of pattern recognition applied to natural randomness, and the sea keeps its secrets well. The journey continues now to the high deserts of Peru, where the Nazca lines have puzzled researchers since their rediscovery in the 1920s. But I want to focus your attention not on the famous monkey, condor, or spider figures, but on something far stranger and less publicized: the Palpa mummies and their association with geometric line complexes that predate the classic Nazca period. Near the modern town of Palpa, about 20 kilometers north of the main Nazca Lines complex, archaeologists working in 1997 excavated a series of shaft tombs containing 41 mummified individuals dating to approximately 400 BCE, placing them in the Paracas culture period that preceded the Nazca civilization. The mummies themselves show typical Paracas burial practices, flexed positions, elaborate textiles, intentional cranial deformation. But 23 of them, more than half, display a feature never documented before or since in pre-Columbian South America. Their tongues had been removed and replaced with gold foil replicas, not figurative representations, but carefully crafted anatomical reproductions complete with taste buds and texture, inserted into the mouth cavity and somehow secured in place. The goldwork is astonishing, requiring microscopic detail and a level of anatomical knowledge that challenges our assumptions about Paracas' medical understanding. Each gold tongue weighs approximately 15 grams and shows evidence of being cast in a two-part mold, then refined with engraving tools to add surface detail. The gold itself, when analyzed, proved to be a specific alloy: 87% gold, 9% silver, 4% copper, not matching any other pre-Columbian metallurgy from the region and requiring a sophisticated understanding of how alloying affects color, melting point, and workability. Where did the Paracas people, who we generally understand as being in relatively early stages of metallurgical development, acquire this knowledge? And why tongues specifically? The obvious interpretation links this to speech, communication, perhaps a belief that the gold tongue would allow the deceased to speak in the afterlife, to communicate with gods or ancestors, to recite prayers or spells that required a pure, incorruptible voice. But removal and replacement is a dramatically different concept than adornment or inclusion. It suggests the original tongue was insufficient, polluted, dangerous, something that had to be removed rather than supplemented. DNA analysis of the mummified remains revealed that all 23 gold tongue individuals shared certain genetic markers suggesting familial relationship, possibly all descendants of a single lineage over 3 or 4 generations. Were we looking at a specific family or clan that practiced this tradition, a hereditary priesthood or elite bloodline that required this modification to fulfill their sacred role? The connection to the geoglyphs compounds the mystery. Directly adjacent to the burial site, the Palpa Desert surface shows a complex of geometric lines, primarily straight paths and spiral patterns, that were created during the same time period as the burials, around 400 BCE. These predate the famous Nazca animal figures by approximately 3 centuries. The Palpa lines don't depict recognizable forms, but instead create what mathematician Maria Reiche, who spent decades studying Nazca geoglyphs, described as interference patterns, intersecting paths that generate emergent designs at their crossings without any single line being inherently meaningful. When you map the gold tongue burial locations and overlay them on the geoglyph patterns, correspondence emerges. Each burial shaft sits at a point where 3 or more geometric lines intersect, never on a single isolated line, always at a node point in the network. This can't be coincidence. The site contained 207 shaft tombs in total, but only the 41 at intersection points contained mummies, and only those 23 with gold tongues occupied the most complex intersections where 4 or more lines met. Subsequent excavations following the line patterns outward from the burial complex found nothing. No structures, no artifacts, no indication of what these paths connected or where they led. They simply terminate after stretches ranging from 100 meters to nearly 3 kilometers, ending at arbitrary points in blank desert. Theories attempting to tie this together range from the mundane to the wildly speculative. Some archaeologists suggest agricultural or astronomical functions for the lines, standard interpretations for Nazca-related geoglyphs, and view the burials as secondary, wealthy individuals who happen to be buried near existing ceremonial infrastructure. That reading requires ignoring the precise spatial correlation and the unprecedented gold tongue modification. Others propose that the Paracas people were engaging in shamanic journey work, that the lines represented paths walked in altered states of consciousness, possibly induced by San Pedro cactus or other psychoactive plants native to the region, and that the gold tongues marked individuals who had achieved specific spiritual states or initiations. The family genetic clustering would support the idea of a hereditary shamanic lineage. A more fringe theory suggests that the lines were directional markers for something traveling above ground level. And yes, this is where ancient astronaut enthusiasts get excited, though terrestrial explanations like smoke signals or light reflection from polished surfaces could account for aerial visibility without invoking extraterrestrial intervention. The gold tongues in this reading become communication devices, perhaps based on some symbolic understanding we don't share, marking individuals who had contact or were attempting contact with these aerial phenomena. What really shifts this from interesting puzzle to genuine enigma is what happened when researchers attempted to use ground-penetrating radar to survey beneath the line intersections in 2004. At 17 of the 23 gold tongue burial locations, the radar detected large voids approximately 5 to 8 meters below the surface, chamber-like spaces that were not natural geological features, but appeared to be deliberately excavated. Permission to excavate these chambers has been repeatedly denied by Peruvian authorities based on preservation concerns and respect for indigenous sacred sites. So we have no idea what, if anything, they contain. The radar signature suggests they're empty or filled with material that doesn't reflect radio waves, which could mean fine sand, water, or certain types of organic material. Local legends from the Palpa region, collected by anthropologists in the early 20th century, speak of houses of silence beneath the desert where the ancestors sleep, waiting for a specific sound or call to awaken them. The Quechua word, used upawasi, literally translates as deaf house or mute house, which creates an eerie resonance with those removed and replaced tongues. Were the gold tongues meant to rest silently until some prophesied moment when they would speak again, when the underground houses would open? It sounds like mythology, like the kind of story communities create to explain mysterious ruins, but it predates the archaeological discovery of the gold tongue mummies by decades, suggesting it preserves some genuine cultural memory. Stand on the Palpa Desert at sunset, the geometric lines stretching to the horizon in every direction, the wind constant and dry, and try to imagine what ritual purpose could demand such precision, such labor, such strange transformation of the dead. We still don't know what message those golden tongues were meant to speak, or to whom, or what lies waiting in those radar-sensed chambers beneath the intersection points, or why this particular family, this specific lineage, required such extraordinary treatment. Our penultimate mystery takes us to the sodden peat bogs of northern Scotland, where Dunvegan's skull circle presents a problem so grim and so carefully structured that it has resisted explanation for 4 decades since its discovery in 1981, on the Isle of Skye, approximately 3 kilometers inland from Dunvegan Castle, in an area of low-lying wetland. A local farmer digging drainage channels encountered a layer of human skulls approximately 1 meter below the surface. Archaeological rescue excavation revealed a circular arrangement measuring 12 meters in diameter, composed of 214 human skulls, all facing inward toward an empty center, embedded in peat that preserved them in remarkable condition. Radiocarbon dating placed the deposit at approximately 350 BCE, the Late Iron Age in Scotland, a period associated with hill fort construction, Celtic art styles, and the cultural complex that would eventually interact with and resist Roman expansion. But the Dunvegan skulls don't fit the mortuary patterns we know from Iron Age Britain. There are no bodies, just skulls, completely separated from their post-cranial skeletons, which have never been found, despite extensive searching of the surrounding area. The skulls show no signs of decomposition in place, no root etching or weathering that would indicate they'd been exposed before burial, suggesting they were defleshed, cleaned, and carefully curated before being arranged in the peat. The demographic profile of the skull population is equally disturbing. Forensic analysis revealed that 168 of the 214 skulls belonged to children between the ages of approximately 3 and 10 years old at death. The remaining 46 were adults, evenly split between male and female, aged between 20 and 40. None showed signs of violent trauma, no cut marks, no blunt force injuries, nothing to indicate how these people died. The teeth were in generally good condition, suggesting adequate nutrition, no evidence of epidemic disease in the bone structure, no indication of a catastrophic population event that would explain why an entire community of children and young adults died simultaneously or in quick succession. The skulls had been modified post-mortem in a specific way. A small hole approximately 8 millimeters in diameter had been drilled through the upper rear portion of each cranium, through the occipital bone, in almost exactly the same location on every single skull. The drilling was done with remarkable precision, no fracturing or splintering around the hole margins, suggesting sharp tools and practiced hands. Threading through these holes were the preserved remains of what fiber analysis identified as horsehair cord, dyed red with an iron oxide pigment, connecting each skull to its neighbors in the circular arrangement, creating a web or network, linking all 214 individuals together. Theories about Dunvegan's skull circle tend toward the macabre, because the evidence leaves little room for benign interpretation. The dominant explanation in academic literature frames this as a catastrophic disease event, possibly plague, or a rapidly spreading epidemic that killed primarily young people, combined with complex mortuary rituals that defleshed, preserved, and interred the skulls as a form of ancestor veneration or memorial. The problem with this reading is the absolute absence of any comparable practice anywhere else in Iron Age Britain or Europe. Skull cults exist in various cultures, from the plastered skulls of Neolithic Jericho to the trophy heads of Iron Age Gaul, but nothing approaching this scale, precision, or demographic specificity. Alternative theories propose human sacrifice, perhaps children offered during a sustained crisis, famine, invasion, or environmental catastrophe, with the adult skulls belonging to those who performed the sacrifices and were then themselves killed to seal the ritual. The empty center of the circle would represent the deity or power to which these lives were offered. This interpretation aligns with evidence from other Iron Age sites showing ritual violence, but it requires us to imagine a level of systematic child killing that most researchers find difficult to accept. A third reading suggests we're misunderstanding the cultural context entirely, that these weren't necessarily unwilling victims, but perhaps individuals who died naturally over a longer period, whose skulls were curated and eventually assembled into this memorial structure, and that the age distribution reflects mortality patterns in a specific community, rather than selection for sacrifice. The location itself adds layers of strangeness. Dunvegan, even today, is remote, sparsely populated, harsh in winter. In the Iron Age, It would have been frontier territory, marginal land, at the edge of the known world from a Mediterranean perspective. Why invest such effort in creating this skull monument in a place that, as far as we can tell, supported only a small, scattered population? Paleo-environmental analysis of the peat indicates that the area was even wetter in the past, essentially a raised bog, difficult to access, definitely not valuable agricultural land. It's as if the site was chosen specifically for its remoteness and inaccessibility, as if whatever happened there needed to be hidden or kept separate from ordinary settlements. Local folklore, which must be treated with appropriate skepticism given how much time separates the Iron Age from when these stories were recorded, mentions the children's choir, a group of juvenile spirits that sing without words in the marshland on certain nights, particularly around the autumn equinox. The stories consistently describe the singing as beautiful but profoundly sad, drawing listeners into the bog, where they become lost. Whether these tales preserve some cultural memory of the skull circle, or are simply the kind of cautionary stories communities tell about dangerous terrain, is impossible to determine. What we can say is that acoustic testing of the site revealed unusual properties. The peat and underlying geology create natural amplification of certain frequency ranges, particularly those in the human vocal range, and sounds emanating from the center of the circle would be audible at significantly greater distances than normal. If the Iron Age people understood this, if they chose the location partly for its acoustic properties, what were they hoping to hear or to broadcast? The most unsettling aspect of Dunvegan's skull circle isn't in the published reports, but in the private notes and correspondence of the excavation director, Dr. Helen Fraser, which were made public after her death in 2019. Fraser described, with obvious reluctance and awareness of how it would sound, a persistent sense that the skulls were arranged not just facing inward, but looking at something specific, that their eyeless sockets all aligned toward a particular point in the circle's empty center, not just generally inward, but precisely converged. She attempted to document this through photogrammetry, creating a computational model of all 214 skull orientations and calculating their sightlines. The results, never formally published because Fraser couldn't find a scientific framework for discussing them, showed convergence within a volume of space approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, suspended 1.2 meters above the ancient ground surface, essentially a point in thin air at roughly adult chest height for someone standing at the center. Fraser wrote in her private journal, "It's as if they're all watching something that was there once, but is no longer visible, or perhaps something that will be there, that they're waiting for." I know how insane that sounds, but after 6 months of working with these skulls, measuring them, recording them, I can't shake the sense that they're oriented toward a presence, not just an empty center. Whether this represents legitimate archaeological intuition or the psychological stress of working intimately with hundreds of dead children's remains is debatable, but it captures something essential about the site's affect. The feeling that you're entering a space designed around an absence, a space where something was or will be, but currently isn't. We still don't know who those 214 people were, how they died, why their skulls, and only their skulls, were preserved and arranged with such care, or what the empty center of their circle was meant to hold or witness. Let me bring you finally to a discovery so recent that its implications are still being argued in heated conference sessions and late-night laboratory discussions. In 2018, during construction of a new subway line in Istanbul, Turkey, excavators broke through into a previously unknown chamber system beneath the historic peninsula, approximately 8 meters below the Byzantine-era street level. The initial assumption was that they'd found more of the vast cistern network that honeycombs Istanbul's ancient districts, But when archaeologists descended to assess the space, they realized they were looking at something no one had expected. The chamber, measuring approximately 40 meters long and 18 meters wide, was a library, not in the modern sense, but in the ancient world's definition, a repository of texts, hundreds of shelves carved directly into the bedrock walls, many still bearing clay tablets, papyrus scrolls sealed in lead containers, and bound codices. The architectural style and initial artifact assessment dated the chamber to approximately 550 CE, late Roman Empire, just before the Byzantine period would fully flower under Justinian. But here's what turned this from an exciting but understandable discovery into something unprecedented. Every single text in the library, from the preliminary cataloging that's been completed on approximately 30% of the collection so far, is written in languages or scripts that do not match any known writing system. The clay tablets bear cuneiform-like symbols that superficially resemble Akkadian or Sumerian scripts, but don't match the sign inventories of any documented Mesopotamian writing system. The papyrus scrolls contain what appears to be alphabetic text, using letter forms that have some commonalities with Greek, Latin, and Coptic, but don't correspond to any of those languages or to any other Mediterranean script. The codices use a completely unique system that combines logographic and phonetic elements in ways that suggest a sophisticated linguistic technology, but that remain completely opaque to translators. Radiocarbon dating and paleographic analysis confirm the materials and inks are genuinely from the 6th century CE. This isn't a modern forgery or later medieval mysticism. Equally important, the texts are clearly organized, sorted by subject based on iconographic elements on the tablets and binding decorations, suggesting this was a functioning library with a classification system, not a random collection or a cache of ritual objects. Subject categories that researchers have tentatively identified based on illustrated sections include astronomy, medicine, engineering, what might be legal codes or philosophical treatises, and extensive botanical documentation with detailed plant illustrations. This was a serious intellectual institution, a repository of knowledge, created by a literate culture in 6th century Istanbul that wrote in languages we can't read and left apparently no other trace. The possibilities this opens are staggering and deeply disruptive to established Byzantine history. The first theory proposes we're looking at an extremely isolated scholarly community, perhaps a secret society or mystery cult that deliberately developed private scripts to protect their knowledge from outside access. Mystery cults certainly existed throughout the late Roman and Byzantine world, and literacy was rare enough that even a known script could serve as effective encryption for most of the population. So a wholly invented writing system would create absolute security. But mystery cults typically dealt in religious symbolism and initiation secrets, not astronomy and botanical science, and the sheer volume of material, preliminary estimates suggest over 4,000 individual texts, indicates a sustained intellectual tradition spanning generations. A second interpretation argues that Istanbul's position as a crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa means the library could contain texts from otherwise unknown cultures, lost languages that were brought to the city by travelers, traders, or refugees from regions that subsequently experienced cultural collapse or conversion. We know many languages died out during late antiquity without leaving sufficient written records for modern decipherment. But that requires believing that 6th century Istanbul hosted a community or institution dedicated to collecting, organizing, and preserving texts in multiple foreign languages without translating them into Greek or Latin, which doesn't align with how translation and knowledge transfer typically functioned in that period. The third theory whispered more than stated openly in academic contexts, proposes temporal compression or misidentification, suggesting the chamber might be significantly older than 550 CE, and that the dating is capturing later use or deliberate backfilling of a much more ancient library, possibly from Bronze Age Anatolia, Hittite period, or even earlier, that was rediscovered and sealed by Byzantine-era people. This would explain the scripts as genuinely ancient languages we haven't yet deciphered, similar to how Linear A from Minoan Crete remains unread despite nearly a century of effort. The counterargument notes that the architectural context, the carving style, the mortar composition, everything about the chamber screams 6th century CE construction, not reuse of something older. We would have to imagine that Byzantine engineers went to extraordinary lengths to create a perfect replica of an ancient library, which strains credibility. What researchers do agree on is that the library was sealed deliberately and rapidly, not abandoned over time, but closed in a single event. The shelves were left fully stocked, no indication of gradual removal of valuable materials, and the entrance was not just closed, but obliterated, filled with rubble and sealed with hydraulic cement, a costly and permanent measure designed to prevent rediscovery. The mythic dimensions of this find come from Byzantine sources themselves. In the writings of Procopius, the great Byzantine historian who chronicled Justinian's reign, there's a curious passage describing a conflict between the emperor and a group he calls the librarians, an otherwise unattested sect or organization that Justinian accused of harboring heretical texts and practicing forbidden arts. Procopius is frustratingly vague, never explaining who these librarians were, where they were located, or what specific heresy they represented. But he notes that Justinian ordered their library destroyed in 537 CE and their members expelled from the city. 13 years later, a different text mentions that certain scholars who write in no Christian tongue were imprisoned during a crackdown on paganism. Were these references to the community that created the Istanbul library? If so, the deliberate sealing makes perfect sense. Either the community themselves hiding their life's work before persecution, or the authorities entombing dangerous knowledge rather than destroying it outright. Byzantine emperors did sometimes preserve rather than destroy heretical or pagan materials, recognizing their potential value even while suppressing their use. But why write in invented scripts in the first place? If they were simply practicing science and philosophy that happened to clash with Christian orthodoxy, why not just write in Greek and keep the library physically hidden, which would be much simpler than inventing multiple writing systems from scratch? The work of decipherment is ongoing, massive computational linguistic analysis, attempting to crack the scripts by identifying patterns, grammatical structures, possible loanwords from known languages. Given the volume of material, if these are genuine languages following natural linguistic rules, they should eventually yield to analysis the way Linear B did in the 1950s, or Mayan glyphs did over decades of patient work. But preliminary results are discouraging. The scripts show lower levels of repetition and pattern predictability than natural languages typically display, which could mean they're extremely sophisticated, or that they're not linguistic in the conventional sense at all. Some researchers have begun entertaining the possibility that we're looking at information storage systems that aren't exactly languages, perhaps mathematical or musical notations, possibly even early conceptual frameworks for symbolic logic or computing analogies. Systems designed to record knowledge in ways that don't map onto spoken language. If that's true, if a 6th century community in Istanbul developed notational systems that prefigure modern symbolic logic by 1400 years, it would represent a discontinuity in intellectual history so profound that we'd need to reconsider fundamental assumptions about when and how certain modes of abstract thought emerged. Local Turkish scholars working on the site have noted that the chamber seems to affect people differently. Some researchers feel energized and focused when working there. Others develop headaches and disorientation, all of which could be explained by poor ventilation or psychological stress, but the consistency of these reports has led to regular air quality monitoring and limiting of access time. The chamber contains nothing obviously hazardous, no mercury, no dangerous molds or radiation, just stone and ancient books, yet it undeniably affects those who spend time in it. We still don't know what language or languages fill those thousands of texts, who created them, what knowledge they contain, why they were hidden so thoroughly, or whether we'll ever be able to read what these mysterious scholars wrote in the twilight years of Rome. And so we come to the end of our journey, back to where we began, standing in that villa in Pompeii with those silent, painted faces watching us from the walls. What connects all these mysteries, from the sealed mouths of Roman frescoes to the counting stones of Sweden, from turquoise chambers in New Mexico to monuments beneath Japanese waves, from golden tongues in Peru to child skulls in Scottish peat, from undecipherable libraries in Istanbul, is the persistent gap between evidence and explanation, between what we can prove and what we can know. Every civilization that has ever existed has created things that seem, to us, inexplicable, not because the people who made them were more mysterious or advanced than we are, but because culture is deep and strange, because human societies invest meaning in objects and actions that don't translate across time without the living context of use and belief. When we stand before these archaeological puzzles, we're not just confronting gaps in the material record, we're facing the limits of empathy, our inability to fully inhabit the worldview of people separated from us by centuries or millennia. They saw the universe differently, categorized reality differently, assigned significance differently, and they left traces of those differences embedded in stone, metal, bone, and paint, waiting for us to stumble upon them and wonder. But here's what these mysteries also reveal: the extraordinary diversity of human, problem-solving, symbolic thinking, and cultural expression. The ancestral Puebloans didn't need to cover a chamber in turquoise. The Paracas didn't need to craft gold anatomical replicas. The Iron Age Scots didn't need to arrange hundreds of skulls in perfect circles. But they did, because human beings everywhere, always, exceed the requirements of mere survival and create meaning, beauty, terror, and sacredness. We are a species that builds monuments to ideas, that transforms materials into statements about the cosmos and our place in it, that records our knowledge and beliefs in forms we hope will outlast our individual lives. Some of those records remain legible, the texts we can still read, the structures whose purposes we understand, the artifacts that fit neatly into our categories. But others resist. They stand outside our frameworks, challenge our chronologies, demand that we acknowledge the possibility that we're missing something, that our maps of the past have blank spaces we haven't begun to fill. The scientists and archaeologists who work on these sites, who measure and catalog and debate and theorize, aren't just collecting data. They're engaged in an act of radical translation, attempting to bridge the gap between different forms of consciousness, different ways of organizing experience into meaning. Sometimes that translation succeeds. Sometimes we crack the code, decipher the script, understand the ritual. But sometimes we don't. And those failures are valuable too, because they remind us of how much we don't know, how much has been lost, how much might still be waiting to be found. Every solved mystery reveals 10 new questions. Every answered question opens onto deeper enigmas, and that's exactly as it should be. Human history isn't a puzzle with a limited number of pieces that will eventually complete. It's an infinitely complex tapestry, where every thread we trace leads to others, where every discovery recontextualizes what we thought we already knew. These mysteries also speak to something primal in us, that need to believe there's more to the world than what we can see and measure, that the past holds secrets beyond mere chronology and artifact typology. The stories we tell about ancient mysteries, the speculations about lost civilizations and forgotten knowledge, aren't just fringe theories or wishful thinking. They're expressions of longing, a desire to connect with something larger and older than our individual lives, to believe that human beings have always reached for transcendence, always sought to encode deep truths in permanent forms. Whether that's actually true, whether ancient people were as obsessed with mystery and meaning as we imagine them to be, is almost beside the point. The mysteries exist. They're real. They're sitting in museum storage facilities and preserved beneath protective shelters and waiting in sealed chambers we haven't found yet. They demand engagement, interpretation, respect, and sometimes they demand that we sit with not knowing, that we accept ambiguity and multiple possibilities instead of forcing premature conclusions. So what do we do with all this uncertainty, all these questions without answers? We keep looking, we keep digging, literally and figuratively. We apply new technologies as they become available. We ask different questions of old evidence. We listen to new voices bringing fresh perspectives to ancient problems. We also tell stories. We preserve the mysteries themselves, even as we try to solve them. Because the mystery is part of the value, part of what makes these sites and objects compelling across generations. A completely explained archaeological site loses some of its power, becomes merely historical rather than numinous, instructive rather than transformative. The unexplained sites, the ones that resist our best efforts at understanding, they retain their capacity to change how we think, to make us question our assumptions, to remind us that human beings have always been stranger, more creative, more diverse in their expressions than we can easily imagine. The Silent Frieze of Pompeii remains silent. The Vendel Stones still bear their uncountable marks. The turquoise chambers keep their secrets. Yonaguni waits beneath the waves. The golden tongues of Palpa speak only in imagination. Dunvegan's skulls watch an empty center, and Istanbul's library guards knowledge in scripts we cannot read. These mysteries will outlast us. They'll still be here long after our current theories have been revised and replaced, still asking their questions, still holding their secrets. And that's beautiful in its way, a reminder that the past isn't dead or static or fully knowable, but living, active, generative, constantly offering new challenges to new generations of seekers. Keep asking questions. Keep examining the evidence with fresh eyes. Keep entertaining possibilities even when they seem unlikely. Because somewhere in all that uncertainty, in all those gaps between what we can prove and what we can only wonder about, lies the truth about who we are as a species, what we've been, what we're capable of becoming. The mysteries aren't obstacles to knowledge, they're invitations to engagement, provocations to think harder and see more clearly, and never settle for easy answers when complex ones might be more accurate. Keep digging, keep wondering, keep standing in those places where the past speaks in languages we don't yet fully understand, because some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting for the right question, the right tool, the right moment to reveal themselves. And when they do, the world will look different than it did before, richer and stranger, and infinitely more worth investigating.